It all started like any other ordinary Tuesday. I kissed him goodbye as he left for a short business trip to a nearby town, expecting him to be back the next evening. I watched him get into the car, waving, and felt the usual warmth in my chest. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual, but by the time night fell, a small knot of worry had already begun to form in my stomach. At first, I tried to push it aside. Maybe his train was delayed. Maybe there was traffic. Simple things. But as hours stretched into the night, the simple explanations began to feel hollow. By midnight, I called his phone straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. I told myself not to panic. He's probably exhausted, I murmured to myself. He'll call in the morning. Morning came, but with it came no call, no text, nothing. I called his office. They had no idea where he was. Panic replaced my rationality. I drove to the train station, hoping perhaps he missed a connection, but there was no record of him boarding any train. By the second day, fear had fully taken hold. I reported him missing to the local authorities, providing his schedule, descriptions, and everything I could remember. Friends and family were called, each offering comfort, but also increasing my anxiety. Maybe he just needed a break, one friend suggested, but their words sounded hollow, almost naive, in the pit of my stomach that told me something was very wrong. Sleep eluded me. I found myself pacing the apartment, checking his messages over and over, replaying the last words we exchanged. "Drive safe," he had said with a smile. Now the smile haunted me. Something had changed, something I couldn't name. On the third day, I scoured social media, hoping to find a clue, an accidental check-in, a tag, a post. Nothing. I even checked his bank account online, praying for a transaction that might explain his location. But the balance remained untouched, as if he had vanished without a trace. I called the police again, desperation in my voice, asking if there were any leads. They had none. I felt the walls closing in. My mind raced with possibilities, most of them terrifying. Accidents, foul play, something unthinkable. Each scenario grew more vivid and plausible with every passing hour. Then, just as dusk settled on the third day, the sound of a key turning in the lock froze me in place. My heart skipped a beat. The door opened slowly, and there he was, disheveled, quiet, eyes distant and hollow. "I'm home," he whispered, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. He stepped inside, dropping his bag by the door. I rushed to him, relieved and terrified at once. Where have you been?" I demanded, clutching his arm. He shook his head slightly, almost in warning. You don't want to know what I saw." And just like that, the knot in my stomach grew into a churning storm of fear. Whatever had happened in those 3 days, it was something unimaginable, something he couldn't or wouldn't share. That night, I stayed awake, watching him sleep, my mind spinning with questions. 3 days had passed, and my world had already changed, but I had no idea just how dark and twisted it was about to get. The morning after he returned, the apartment felt strangely heavy. The air seemed thicker, almost charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I watched him move around the kitchen quietly, making coffee with a stiffness I had never seen before. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided my gaze, focusing intently on the steam rising from the mug in his hands. "Are you okay?" I asked cautiously, my voice breaking the silence. He glanced at me, eyes shadowed, and gave a tight, almost forced smile. "I'm fine," he replied, but the words felt hollow. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but the unease that had been gnawing at me since his return refused to fade. Something had changed in him, something I couldn't yet name. Throughout the day, he kept himself busy with chores and errands, but I noticed the subtle oddities. He flinched at sudden noises, avoided mirrors, and kept checking his phone as though expecting a message that never came. When I tried to ask about the 3 days he had disappeared, He either brushed me off or grew irritable. Each time, the room seemed to shrink a little, the tension between us thickening like smoke. By evening, I could no longer ignore the sense that he was hiding something. My curiosity mixed with fear, forming a gnawing urgency to uncover the truth. I started searching for clues myself, scanning his belongings, checking his phone when he left the room. What I found made my stomach twist. A small folded note in his wallet that simply read, "You shouldn't have come back." When I confronted him about it, he froze, staring at me with wide eyes that seemed to carry both fear and warning. I can't explain it yet," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's better if you don't know. You wouldn't understand." That night, sleep became impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of his return. The haunted look in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the cryptic note, none of it made sense. I wanted to believe that everything was normal, that he had simply been through something stressful, but deep down, I knew the truth was far more sinister. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. He was present but distant, his laughter forced, his words measured. Occasionally, I caught him murmuring something under his breath, fragments of sentences that vanished before I could understand them. Every interaction seemed charged, as if the air around us carried a secret we were both circling, but not yet daring to confront. Then came the night when I awoke to him standing at the window, staring out at the darkened street below. "I can't sleep," he said quietly. "Not after what I've seen." "What did you see?" I whispered, inching closer, desperate for answers. He shook his head slowly, and I saw the faintest twitch in his lips, a warning, almost a plea. "You really don't want to know," he repeated, echoing the words from the night he returned. And in that moment, I realized that whatever had happened during those 3 days had changed him, changed us, in ways I wasn't yet prepared to face. The fear that had been growing in the back of my mind was now undeniable. Our lives were no longer the same, and the truth he carried was darker than I could have imagined. The days following his return passed in a blur of unease. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, physically present but emotionally distant, leaving a trail of subtle anomalies that I could no longer ignore. At first, they were small. A muddy footprint on the kitchen floor, a key that didn't belong to any of our doors, an envelope tucked between the cushions of the sofa that I hadn't seen before. Curiosity gnawed at me until it became impossible to resist. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and blurred, showing a shadowy figure standing at the edge of a dense forest. I didn't recognize the location, but my heart lurched. There was something about the posture of the figure unnervingly human, yet impossibly wrong, that made my skin crawl. Then I found the note he had hidden under the coffee table. "Don't follow me, not yet. You'll regret it." My fingers trembled as I read it. Who had written this note, him or someone else? And why was it left in a place he surely knew I would find? That evening, I tried to speak to him about the photograph. "What is this?" I asked, holding it out. His face paled, and he quickly snatched it from my hands. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking, a tremor that betrayed the calm he tried so hard to project. Over the next few days, the clues continued to pile up. Receipts for stores I didn't recognize, strange numbers of unknown origin appearing in his bank transactions, messages on his phone that disappeared before I could read them fully. Each discovery painted a picture more disturbing than the last, though none of it made literal sense yet. It was as if he had stepped into a world that I was not meant to understand. One night, I decided to follow him. He left the apartment silently, slipping into the darkness, and I trailed him at a distance. He moved quickly, deliberately, heading toward the edge of the town where the streets gave way to forested hills. And there, illuminated by a dim streetlight, I saw him stop and look over his shoulder, as if sensing something or someone was watching. I held my breath, terrified he would notice me. Then he pulled a small object from his pocket, something metallic that reflected the faint light. He murmured a name I couldn't quite catch and placed the object carefully on the ground. He didn't see me. He didn't even know I was there. I returned home that night shaken, clutching the photograph and the image of his furtive movements. Whatever he had encountered during those 3 days had left him marked, changed, and now it was spilling into our world, leaving breadcrumbs I was desperate and afraid to follow. By now, it was clear. He had been through something no one should ever face, something terrifying enough to silence him completely. And yet, despite the warnings and the fear, I felt an irresistible pull to uncover the truth. I needed to know what he had seen, even if it meant exposing myself to the same darkness that had haunted him. The following days felt like walking through a fog. He was present, yet absent, moving through the apartment with a mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. Even simple things, pouring a cup of coffee, flipping a page in a book, seemed to require an effort I couldn't understand. Every glance at him brought a chill, a sense that beneath his surface, something dark and unspoken simmered. Whenever I tried to speak about those 3 days, he froze. A shadow passed over his features, his eyes darkening, and his hand would clench tightly. "I told you," he murmured one evening, "you don't want to know." But my curiosity had become unbearable. I couldn't let it go. Something had happened, something that had changed him in a way I couldn't ignore. Then came the subtle signs. Objects shifted from their usual places. His watch on the kitchen counter instead of the dresser, a set of keys on the bookshelf. Notes that weren't there before appeared on tables, scribbled in his handwriting, with words like "stay away" or "it's not safe." So even our dog, normally playful and curious, would growl at corners of the room, stiffening as if sensing a presence I couldn't see. One evening, he disappeared again, this time for only a few hours, but his absence left a palpable tension. When he returned, he refused to answer my questions. His hands shook as he placed a box on the table, wrapped neatly in brown paper. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding. Inside were strange objects, a small vial of dark liquid, a folded piece of paper with symbols I didn't recognize, and a key that didn't fit any lock in the apartment. "You need to leave this alone," he warned, his voice low and tight. "I can't protect you if you dig further." But the warning only intensified my resolve. I began keeping notes, tracking patterns in his behavior, recording the strange occurrences, and trying to connect the dots. There was something or someone he had encountered, and it wasn't just a fleeting encounter. It was real, dangerous, and it had followed him back. That night, I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the city outside and the quiet rhythm of his breathing. But every so often, I caught him staring at corners of the room, whispering names or phrases under his breath. It was a language I didn't understand, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. By the end of the week, I realized something terrifying. The 3 days he had disappeared had left a residue, a presence that permeated our home. And he wasn't the only one affected. I could feel it too, a growing anxiety, a creeping dread that clung to the edges of my thoughts. It was clear that whatever he had witnessed was far more than a personal trauma. It was a secret, a danger, a truth so immense that speaking it aloud could bring it into our lives. And yet, despite his avoidance, I knew I couldn't stop searching. Whatever was lurking in the shadows, I had to uncover it. Even if it meant facing the same horrors that had haunted him for 3 days. It started with a knock at the door late one night. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound echoed through the apartment like a warning. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before peeking through the peephole. Nobody was there. Only a small envelope lay on the doormat, illuminated by the dim glow of the hallway light. I picked it up with trembling hands. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in neat, deliberate letters. Inside, a single piece of paper read, "Stop looking, it's not safe. What he saw. It wants you too." I felt my stomach twist. The handwriting was eerily familiar. Almost like his butt, the message carried a weight of danger I had never felt from him. My first instinct was to run, to forget everything I had seen since his return. But fear was replaced by a more stubborn impulse. I needed answers. Later that night, I confronted him. He was sitting in the dark living room, staring at the flickering TV screen that wasn't even on. I held up the note. "Did you send this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He flinched, eyes widening. "No," he said finally, shaking his head. I don't know who it's from. But I've seen this before. It's a warning, a way to scare you. You shouldn't have opened it." I pressed him further, my frustration growing alongside my fear. "What is happening? Why are all these things happening? What did you see?" His hands tightened around his knees. "I told you, you don't want to know." But this time, there was something different in his voice. It wasn't just fear, there was desperation, almost a pleading, as if he were trying to protect me from something he couldn't explain. The next few days were a tense blur. Strange occurrences multiplied. Objects moved on their own, shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispers echoing through the apartment when no one else was home. Every time I looked at him, I could see the same haunted expression he had worn the day he returned. Then came the text message. It arrived at 3:17 a.m., a string of numbers and symbols I couldn't decipher. Beneath it, a single line in plain English. "Stop before it's too late." My phone buzzed again, and again, until it was a relentless alarm in the dead of night. I tried to talk to him about it, but he became agitated, almost violent in his panic. "I warned you," he shouted, pacing the room. "You don't understand. You can't fight this. Whatever I saw, it's not just me. It will reach you if you don't stop." And that's when I realized the truth. The danger wasn't just in what he had seen. It was in the knowledge itself. It was in the act of seeking, of uncovering. Every clue, every question, every moment of curiosity was a beacon, drawing something toward us. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the city and the uneven rhythm of his breathing beside me. The note, the shadows, the whispers, they all pressed against the edges of reality, reminding me that the 3 days he had disappeared were just the beginning. Whatever had touched him, whatever had followed him home, had now reached me. And the deeper I dug, the closer it came. By now, the tension in our apartment was almost unbearable. Shadows no longer just flickered at the edge of my vision, they moved with purpose. Objects weren't simply displaced. They were positioned as if someone or something was trying to communicate. Every evening, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. One night, while he was in the kitchen, I noticed something chilling. A photo of us on the wall, which had hung straight for years, was now crooked. But more than that, someone had written something in the condensation on the window pane. "I see you." My hands shook as I pointed it out. He froze. The pale, haunted expression that had become his permanent mask returned. "You shouldn't have seen that," he whispered, voice tight with fear. "It knows you're watching now." I demanded answers. "What is happening? What did you see in those 3 days?" He swallowed hard, pacing the room. "It's hard to explain. It's not human. Not exactly. It's aware. It can track attention, curiosity, thoughts, even emotions. It came to me because of something I found. And now, it's coming for you too." The reality hit me like a punch. The fear wasn't imaginary. It wasn't paranoia. Whatever had touched him was capable of reaching me, following my thoughts, my movements. Every instinct screamed to run, but my heart wouldn't allow me to abandon him. The threats became tangible. One morning, I found a blade of some sort, sharpened and darkened with rust, lying on the bathroom counter next to a note that simply said, "You're next." No fingerprints, no explanation, just the silent weight of danger. We tried to leave the apartment, but even that proved impossible. Every exit felt surveilled. Every street lamp seemed to flicker as we passed. I could sense the presence trailing us, always just beyond the corner of vision, waiting. He became increasingly agitated, snapping at small things, muttering names and warnings under his breath. "It's not just after me anymore," he confessed one night, sitting on the edge of the bed, face buried in his hands. "It's aware of us. Together. And it's clever. It waits, watches, calculates." Despite his fear, I refused to step back. I began documenting everything: the notes, the photographs, the strange occurrences. Each detail might become a clue, a way to understand and perhaps defend against whatever had invaded our lives. By now, I was no longer just a witness. I was a participant, entwined in a danger that had chosen us. The 3 days he had disappeared were only the start. The real ordeal was only beginning, and every attempt to uncover the truth risked drawing this entity even closer. That night, as we sat in the dark, I could hear it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the corners of the room. It said my name, and in that instant, I understood. It wasn't just coming. It had already arrived. The presence no longer stayed hidden in the shadows. That night, I saw it, or something unmistakably real. I had been pacing the living room, trying to calm my racing thoughts, when a movement in the corner of my eye made me freeze. A dark shape lingered there, shifting, almost melting into the walls. I blinked. Nothing. My husband noticed my frozen stance and followed my gaze. Don't look at it directly," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It feeds on attention." But curiosity and fear had a grip I couldn't shake. I glanced again, and the shape solidified. Humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, movements unnatural, and its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, glowed faintly, reflecting a malevolent intelligence. My heart pounded, and I stumbled back. It was the first time I realized this entity could make itself visible, but selectively. It wasn't confined to shadows. It could manipulate what I perceived, luring me into panic. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I knew it would follow. My husband stepped between me and the shape, raising his hands. "It's trying to intimidate you. Stay calm. Don't respond. Don't engage." "Engage or not," the entity responded. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, breath-forming clouds before me. A low, distorted whisper filled the space, repeating my name over and over, bending around the corners of the room like a physical force. I clutched my chest, trembling. "What does it want?" I managed to whisper. "It wants acknowledgement," he said grimly. "It wants fear, attention, doubt. It feeds on what it can manipulate." That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it lurking, just beyond vision. The walls of the apartment seemed to shrink, closing in, as if it were testing the boundaries of its influence. The next day, more manifestations appeared. Objects began moving on their own. A lamp rolling across the floor, the refrigerator door swinging open, pictures tilting. My husband warned me not to react, but every instinct to scream or flee felt overpowering. I felt its presence wrap around me, invisible yet undeniable. We tried to find patterns, trying to predict when it would appear, how it would act. But the entity was clever, adaptive. It learned from our reactions, molding the environment to terrify, confuse, and isolate us. Every shadow, every flicker of movement became a calculated reminder that it was in control, and we were not. By the end of the week, a horrifying realization settled over me. It wasn't enough to simply avoid it. This entity could follow thought, fear, and curiosity itself. No place was safe, no corner of reality untouched. And the deeper we tried to uncover the truth behind its arrival, the closer it drew, intent on consuming everything we understood as normal. That night, as I lay awake, I felt its gaze directly on me, probing, calculating, patient. It had become more than a presence. It had become a predator one that understood the very essence of fear. By now, our apartment no longer felt like a home. It was a cage. Every corner, every shadow seemed alive, shifting subtly as if to trap us in a state of constant vigilance. Sleep was minimal, our nerves raw from days of sustained terror. The entity's presence had grown stronger, bolder, more direct. It began manipulating our environment in increasingly threatening ways. Doors slammed shut without reason, lights flickered in intricate patterns, and mirrors reflected things that weren't there. A dark silhouette standing behind me when I turned to face it. Even my husband, whose fear had always been contained, began showing cracks. One evening, we returned from a brief errand to find the living room rearranged. Furniture was stacked at odd angles, and a series of notes were scattered across the floor, each written in the same careful, deliberate hand. "You can't hide. You can't run. I see you both." My husband's face paled. "It's escalating," he said quietly. "It's testing boundaries now. It wants to see how far it can push us before we break." I noticed subtle changes in him, too. He would flinch at sounds I couldn't hear, pause mid-sentence as if listening to something in another room, and mutter warnings I didn't understand. Anxiety clung to him like a second skin, and yet he refused to leave. "We can't run," he told me. "It's everywhere. Running only draws its attention." The next night, the entity made its first physical contact. I was sitting on the couch when something cold brushed my hand, like a fleeting shadow made solid. My heart jumped, and my husband grabbed my arm to steady me. "It's feeling you out," he whispered, testing its reach. I began documenting everything with cameras and voice recorders, desperate for proof, desperate for any way to understand it. But the recordings revealed only static, faint whispers, shadows that didn't match anything in the room. The more we tried to expose it, the more aggressive it became. Even our interactions with the outside world started to warp. Friends who visited described a feeling of unease, as though the air in our apartment had a weight they couldn't explain. Some left abruptly, claiming an undefined terror. My husband and I were isolated, trapped in a bubble of fear with a predator that fed on everything we knew. Then, one night, we heard a voice clear, unmistakable, and chillingly calm. It spoke directly to me. "You shouldn't have opened your eyes." My husband's hand clamped over my mouth to keep me from screaming, but the words left a mark deeper than fear. They carved doubt, confusion, and panic into my mind. By the end of the week, it was obvious. This entity wasn't just haunting us. It was reshaping our reality, bending the rules of the world around us, making every familiar object and sound a potential threat. We were no longer observers. We were participants, pawns in a game we could not hope to understand. And the most terrifying part? It was patient. It could wait. It could linger for days, weeks, months, until we made a mistake. And every mistake brought it closer to claiming us completely. By now, fear had become a constant pulse in our veins. The apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It was a trap, every shadow a potential doorway for the entity. It had grown bold, no longer hiding behind subtle movements or whispers. Its presence was heavier, more oppressive, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred with every passing hour. It began targeting my husband directly. Small things at first: a chair tipped over when he entered a room, lights flickering when he reached for the stove, cold spots that followed him like a trail. But soon the attacks became more aggressive. One night, I woke to hear a low, guttural growl from the kitchen. My husband had been standing there, staring blankly at the refrigerator, frozen in fear, as if the entity's weight pressed him to the floor. He turned to me, eyes wide and trembling. "It's not just in the apartment anymore," he whispered. "It can reach me. It can reach us anywhere we go." I tried to remain rational, to hold on to a shred of logic, but nothing explained what was happening. Cameras, recordings, even leaving the apartment for brief moments did nothing. The entity followed, adapting, learning, anticipating our every move. Then came the first physical mark. My husband woke to find a deep scratch along his arm. There was no one else in the apartment, no explanation, and yet the wound was fresh, raw, deliberate. The entity was no longer content with fear alone. It wanted to hurt, to leave a signature that we were being watched and hunted. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every sigh of the building, every flicker of the lights set my heart racing. We barely ate, barely spoke, barely moved without checking every corner for the unseen presence. The entity seemed to take pleasure in our exhaustion, our vulnerability, knowing that each moment of weakness brought it closer to victory. Then the worst happened. One night, while I was in the bedroom, the entity whispered my name directly, so close I could feel its cold breath. I turned, and the air itself seemed to bend around me, as if invisible hands were pressing against my skin. My husband tried to intervene, but he froze mid-step, a sudden paralyzing fear rooting him to the spot. The entity's message was clear. It had control. We were no longer just observers of its power. We were its prey. Every attempt to escape, every thought of resistance was met with calculated pressure. It wasn't just haunting us. It was shaping us, breaking down our reality, teaching us that the world we trusted no longer existed. That night, I realized the terrifying truth. Whatever had taken an interest in us was patient, intelligent, and relentless. It wasn't going to stop, and it wasn't going to negotiate. The entity was preparing for something far more dangerous, something that would demand a choice between survival and sanity. As I sat clutching my husband's trembling hands, I knew the final confrontation was coming. The entity was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. It would strike, and we had to be ready, or we would lose everything. The apartment was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest, making every heartbeat thunder in your ears. We knew it was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The entity had grown bolder over the past days, its presence almost tangible, like a living shadow that clung to every surface. We made a decision. We could no longer run or hide. We had to confront it, to face the terror that had consumed our lives. My husband and I gathered every camera, every recording device, every piece of technology that might capture it, and barricaded ourselves in the living room. The air was thick with tension, and even our own breaths sounded like intrusions into the oppressive silence. At first, nothing happened. Just shadows stretching along the walls, subtle movements that almost seemed natural. Then, slowly, the temperature dropped, and the lights flickered violently. A low, distorted whisper filled the room. "You can't escape. You can't hide." I held my husband's hand, feeling his tremor echo my own. "We have to stay calm," he said, voice barely a whisper. "It feeds on fear." I focused on the recordings, hoping to capture something tangible, something that would give us leverage. Suddenly, the shadow began to take form, coalescing into a figure that was humanoid, but grotesquely wrong, limbs twisted, eyes glowing faintly, movements impossible. It stepped closer, and the air itself seemed to bend, pushing against us, testing our resolve. "You shouldn't have come this far," it hissed, voice layered with distortion, echoing from every corner of the room. But we held our ground. We spoke together, naming it, acknowledging its presence without fear. "We see you! You don't control us!" my husband shouted, his voice trembling but firm. For a moment, it froze. The entity recoiled, as if our defiance disrupted it. The whispers faltered, the shadows stilled, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I realized then that the entity's power came from our fear, our doubt, our uncertainty. We pressed forward, speaking and documenting simultaneously. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and every word we uttered chipped away at its hold. Slowly, the shadow began to unravel, its shape dissolving into the corners of the room, until finally it dissipated entirely, leaving only a cold, empty silence. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat in the stillness, hearts racing, minds reeling from the confrontation. It was over for now, but we knew the threat hadn't disappeared entirely. Entities like this didn't vanish. They waited, patient, for the next opening. But for the first time in days, we felt a sense of relief. Fear no longer dominated our thoughts. The apartment felt like ours again, even if only temporarily. We had faced the darkness, stared into the impossible, and survived. And as we held each other, exhausted but resolute, I realized something crucial. Fear gives power, but courage, even when trembling, can reclaim it. Whatever comes next, we will face it together,